probably see me wandering around with my 3 dogs. I have lived in Bradley, Huddersfield all my life. A few years back I decided to do a few local history videos based on Alan Whitworth's fantastic book. The original videos had the narration scrolling down the screen, but I decided to actually narrate them this time. So I'll start at the beginning. This is my back garden. That's me as a baby with my mum, and that's me in my back garden in 2020. The house I live at was built in 1936, just after the Bradley Road was widened, and this is where I'll start my story. The widening of Bradley Road. In December 1930, sewer laying operations were commenced, and other parts of the work proceeded with real earnest. As much work as possible was done without interfering with the through traffic, but in July 1931 the work had reached such a stage that it could not possibly be continued satisfactorily without closing the road for a short period. This work was carried out on July 27th of that year, and eventually the scheme found employment for a large number of men in very difficult times during the Great Depression. The number of men employed continuously on the work from December 1930 averaged 204, with a maximum of 331 men employed during the busiest period. The length of the road that was widened and reconstruction measured about 2¼ miles in length. The average width of the lane before widening was 30 feet between fences, and the steepest gradient was 1 in 13. The old lane itself was considered very tortuous. In order to obtain a better line, the new road was constructed entirely clear of the old route in some places, and where this occurred, the site of the old Bradley Lane was converted into agricultural land or transferred to the abutting owners. The level of the new roadway is 16 feet below the level of the old highway at its worst point near Bell Cottage, as in the picture. The level of the Bradley Road west of the entrance to the former Bradley Gate Sanatorium was raised 3 feet for some distance. In other places, the road was raised or lowered according to its circumstances. The scheme involved the demolition of 18 dwelling houses, 1 shop, 1 farmhouse and a number of farm buildings. It is probable that many of our present-day footpaths which go across fields have their roots in the common pathways of the Middle Ages, if not earlier. Other roads and byways include Steep Lane, which must have come into existence during the early period, as its course ran from the Bradley Lane beside the house known as Bradley Grange towards the River Calder and the old mill at Kirklees by way of Bradley Hall, the manorial seat of the medieval village. And it is probable that at one time there was a crossing near the watermill, and the highway continued up Mill Lane and the other side towards Clifton and Clifton Moor. Steep Lane, I recall, like many other old lanes of the district, had a raised causey. Today only an handful of older properties survive from the distant past. Possibly the most well known is the building on Bradley Road known as Bradley Grange. This probably is the oldest dwelling in the village, and most certainly dates from the 16th century, if not before, although the exterior today only originates from the 18th century. In the backyard there survives a large deep well dating from the 14th century. Bradley Grange is reputed to be the site of the original monk settlement established by Fountains Abbey, and the existence of this early well undoubtedly supports them. In antiquity, Bradley Hall is probably the next oldest dwelling. Adjacent to Bradley Grange is Steep Lane, barred with a wooden gate and entered by pedestrians via an adjoining stone stile. This ancient byway, which is today partially lost in a new housing estate behind Bradley Grange, runs up and over the ridge of land before descending, as its name suggests, sharply down to the river plain. Towards the lower end, where Steep Lane crosses the railway track by means of a level crossing, stands Bradley Hall. The facade of Bradley Hall is older than Bradley Grange in part, and the farm is a typical lathe house of the West Riding, where barn, byre and house all sit under one long continuous roof. The origins of Bradley Hall are still obscure, and confusion often occurs between whether this farmstead is the manorial site or Bradley Hall Farm, a little further along the trackway towards the River Calder, and not far from Kirklees Mill, which is now an hotel, on the opposite bank, which is itself an ancient manorial mill site. At the time of the Luddite uprising in the district, number 35 Oak Road was still an inn, and it is recorded that a number of the Luddite fraternity who marched with the body of insurrectionalists intent on attacking Rawfords Mill in 1812 met here before joining the assembled throng at the Dumb Steeple, a local landmark. At what point in history number 35 Oak Road ceased to be a public house is uncertain. In the early years of the century it had become a local post office kept by John Spence. By the early 18th century, the nucleus of Bradley appears to have shifted, centering on Oak Lane, later Oak Road, and Bradley Lane, later renamed Bradley Road. The only dated house in the village is to be found on the present Oak Road, and an ornate stone over the doorway of number 35 carries the date and inscription JSB 1751. This probably refers to John and Susanna Brooke, and she may well be the same Susanna Brooke of Bradley buried at Mirfield in 1756. Today the row of cottages is considerably enlarged from their original size, with extensions to the rear and principally behind number 33, but the fronts remain relatively untouched. Here we see a typical stone mullioned windows of the period, long and low and suggestive of weavers' cottages. However, by 1760 the building was an inn called the Golden Cock, and it may have been first erected as such. In the last years of the 1960s, its role as the post office was taken over by another, and the cottage on Oak Road became a private residence. Alongside the space between the three cottages and the end house of the road, Victoria Terrace houses let to Oaks Lane, an old roadway which roughly followed the course of the present Olde Road and formed part of the ancient highway to Huddersfield from Leeds. It was along here that stood Oaks House and Oaks Farm, recorded in the early documents, alas, which were both lost in the redevelopment of Bradley in the late 1940s. Oaks House was mentioned as early as 1277 and took its name from the family called Del Oaks. That this area became the principal centre of the village in the 18th century is supported by the number of houses and homesteads of this period that have survived hereabouts. We have already mentioned Bradley Grange, which was restyled about this time, and just below the Grange another house of this period exists, 142 Bradley Road. Unchanged for many years, this listed building was shamefully modernised in 1986, the loss of much of its character. It was then that the owner worsened this situation by putting a modern bungalow adjacent to it. In 1829 it was in the occupation of Martha Lee at a yearly rent of 5 guineas and comprised of a cottage with a stable garden and enclosed grassland called P Croft. The total holding amounted to just over 2 acres. During the conversion of 142 Bradley Road, Bell Cottage, I recorded a little of its architectural history, which revealed that it had been originally 2 dwellings, both of which have only had 1 room upstairs and a single room downstairs, with a small scullery kitchen behind. When I was younger, the house was rented by a lady called Vera Wade. Round here towards Kirklees Top Lock. This was the site of my great-great-granddad's lock house. We were born around 1830 and they were real wild old back then. It says on here the population in 1819 of Bradley was roughly around about 90. In 1867 we're about 781, and probably today it's around about 30,000, and they still want to build some more houses.